All right, 2.7, part 2. We're going to talk about composition functions. So in part 1, we did combinations of functions where we added, subtracted, multiplied, and divided our functions. In composition functions, we're going to be given two functions, and we're going to put one into the other one. So we're kind of combining them together. So composition functions can be written as f of g of x, or like this, which is the same thing, f of g of x. You always work from the inside out. So here we would take g of x and put it inside of the f function. Same thing with the other one. We would take g of x and put it inside the f. So these two things are written a little bit differently, but they mean exactly the same thing. So the homework is either going to write it as fog, f of g, or the other way where g of x is inside of f. But they mean the same thing. They're asking you to do exactly the same. We're also going to be asked to find the domain of our composition functions. So for the domain, it is the overlap of the domain of the inside function and the whole function. So if we were asked to find the domain of f of g of x, we would have to check the domain for g of x, find what that is, and for the whole function f of g of x. And whatever overlaps between those are the domain of our function. So you always just have to check the domain of the inside function too. All right, let's do some examples. So looking at example 3 on the next page, it asks us to find the functions f of g and then g of f and their domain. So let's start by finding f of g. So it can be written like fog, or it can be written like f of g of x. We always start with the inside one and work our way out. So we're taking our g of x and we're going to plug that into the x in f. So I take my whole function g and I'm plugging that into the x in the f function. So this would be x minus 3 squared. Now, sometimes you might be able to combine like terms and simplify. I think if you leave it like this, like x minus 3 squared, it would take that on WebAssign as correct. You wouldn't have to do any other simplifying. How could I simplify this though? What would I do? We would FOIL, write it twice and FOIL it out. But I think on WebAssign you can just leave it like this as an answer. Now let's find our function g. This is actually still a. We want to find g of f of x, which is the same thing as written like g of f of x. So now we're taking our function g, we're taking our function f, the one on the inside, and plugging it into g. So we take our function f and plug it into g. So this would be x squared minus 3. Any questions there? So now for our domain, we want to find the domain of each one. So for our domain for f of g, we always want to check the domain of the inside function and the domain of our total composition function. Remember, we only have restrictions on our domain when we have fractions and when we have square roots. So what would my domain of my g function be? X minus 3, what's the domain there? Do we have a fraction? Do we have a square root? Where? No. So what's our domain? All real numbers. What's our domain of x minus 3 squared? Do I have a fraction? Do I have a square root? So x minus 3 squared, the composition function that we found here, what's our domain? All real numbers. So the overlapping of those two, if they're both all real numbers, what's our domain of the whole thing? All real numbers. How would we write that in interval notation? Negative infinity to positive infinity. Let's find our domain for the second one, g of f. So we always want to check the inside function and the whole thing. So what's our domain for f? If we have x squared, what's our domain there? All real numbers. We don't have any fractions, we don't have any square roots, we don't have to worry about our domain, it's all real numbers. What about for x squared minus 3? What's our domain there? All real numbers. So the overlapping of the two would be all real numbers, and how do we write that in interval notation? Negative infinity to positive infinity. Now for b, we want to find f of g of 5. So we're going to take 5 and plug it into x in our f of g. So this would be 5 minus 3 squared. What's 5 minus 3? And what's 2 squared? 4. So f of g of 5 would be 4. Next, we want to find g of f of 7. So g of f was this function here, so I'm going to plug 7 into that one. So we have 7 squared minus 3. What's 7 squared? And 49 minus 3? 46. So g of f of 7 would be 46. We could also have composition functions with 3 functions. So if we had f of g of h, we always start from the inside. We'll take h of x, plug that into g, and then we take that answer and plug it into f. So you're doing the same thing when you have 3 functions. Just start from the inside and work your way out. So in example 5, we have a composition of 3 functions. So it's asking me for f of g of h. So which one would I start with? H. We take h, and what are we plugging it into? We take h and plug it into what? X plus 3 is h. What are we plugging that into? Handler, what are we plugging x plus 3 into? X to the 10th power. We're plugging it into g. So we work our way backwards. Take h, plug it into g. So this becomes x plus 3 to the 10th power. So this is g of h. So I take g of h and plug it into what? Plug it into f. So we're going to take this, plug it into both of the x's in f. So f of g of h is going to be x plus 3 to the 10th power over x plus 3 to the 10th power plus 1. Right, last question, example 6, we're recognizing a composition of functions. So we're given, notice that this is a capital F of x is equal to the 4th root of x plus 9. It says find the functions f and g such that capital F is the composition function. So this is our composition function. This is f of g. So we want to find what f of x is and what g of x. Well, which function goes on the inside of the other one? What's the inside function? Ryan, what's our inside function? It's asking us for f of g. Which one's going on the inside? G. G is the inside one. So given the fourth root of x plus 9, what do you think the function on the inside is? So the inside part is x plus 9. What do you think the outside, so if we're taking x plus 9 and plugging it into f, what do you think our function f is? The fourth root of what? Just x. Because we would take the inside and plug it in, which would give us f of g, the composition. So this is kind of just like dissecting it into parts.